The morning Elara Voss rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, with nothing but a carpetbag, a letter of employment, and a stubborn set to her jaw, every man on the Caldwell Ranch stopped what he was doing and stared. It was the spring of 1882, and the Texas Panhandle was still rough enough to swallow a person whole if they were not careful. The land stretched in every direction like a faded quilt, all amber grass and red earth, and sky so wide it made your chest ache to look at it too long. The town of Dusty Creek had a general store, a telegraph office, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a saloon that never closed, and 300 souls who all knew each other's business before breakfast. Elara was 23 years old, brown-haired, brown-eyed, with the kind of quiet determination that people often mistook for coldness until they spent more than 5 minutes in her company. She had come from Kansas City after her father's death left her with no family, no income, and no intention of sitting still and grieving herself to dust. She had answered an advertisement placed by one Harold Caldwell, a cattle rancher of some considerable standing in the region, who required a housekeeper and cook for his ranch operation. The letter he sent back was brief and practical, which she appreciated. The salary was fair, which she appreciated even more. The Caldwell Ranch was 3 miles outside of town, and the cowhand who had been sent to collect her from the stagecoach depot was a broad, freckled young man named Pete Dawson, who talked the entire ride without stopping once for breath. "Mr. Caldwell is a decent employer," Pete said, clicking the horses along a dusty trail that wound between scrubby cedar trees. "He is fair about wages and does not make a habit of cheating a man. Ranch runs about 40 cowhands during the busy season, fewer in the winter. Good bunkhouse. Hot meals, leastways they were hot before Mrs. Prout left for her sister's place in San Antonio. That is why you are here, I expect." "That is correct," Elara said, watching the land open up around them as the cedar thinned and the grass began. "You will meet everybody soon enough," Pete continued. "Good group of men on the whole, work hard, do not cause trouble. Well, most of them do not cause trouble." He paused and she noticed the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth. "Most," she repeated. Pete hesitated. He was the kind of young man who filled silence with words but clearly had not decided how to fill this particular silence. "There is one fellow," he said finally, "goes by Cole Merritt. He has been with the ranch about 8 months now. Good cowhand, I will give him that. Probably the best roper we have got, and he can read cattle like most men read a newspaper. But he is," Pete searched for the word, "complicated." "Complicated how?" Another hesitation. "He just is not a man you want to get too close to, Miss Voss. The other hands, they mostly leave him be. He does not eat in the cookhouse with the others except sometimes. He does not drink with them in town. He does not talk much, and when he does, he is not always gentle about it. He has a temper that comes on quiet-like, which is the worst kind." Elara turned this information over in her mind without saying anything. She was not particularly worried. She had grown up with a father who was frequently difficult and occasionally thunderous, and she had learned early that a man who was labeled troublesome by other men was often merely inconvenient to people who preferred ease over honesty. "I appreciate the warning," she said politely, and Pete seemed to take this as an agreement to be wary, because he relaxed and began talking about the spring roundup. Harold Caldwell was a stout, white-haired man of 58 with a handshake like a vice grip and eyes the color of faded denim. He met her at the ranch house door, looked her over with the same assessing gaze he likely used on horses he was considering purchasing, and appeared satisfied. "You have experience cooking for large numbers?" he asked. "My father ran a boarding house for 6 years," she said. "I cooked for 18 men regularly." "Good. Kitchen is yours. Breakfast at 5:30 for the hands before they ride out. Supper at 6. I eat separately here in the house. You will have Sundays free after the midday meal." He handed her a key on a ring. "Your room is off the kitchen, small but private." He looked at her once more. "You do not look like you frighten easily." "I do not," she said. "Good," he said again, and that was the end of the interview. He turned and walked back inside, and Elara stood in the doorway of her new life and breathed in the smell of cattle and dust and cedar, and decided she liked it. She spent the first afternoon unpacking and learning the kitchen, which was a spacious and well-supplied room attached to the main ranch house by a covered walkway. There was a good iron stove, a deep pantry, proper shelving, and a window that looked out toward the barn and the flat expanse of grazing land beyond. She went through the supplies and made a list of what needed replenishing, and then she began supper, because there was no sense in putting off the first impression. She made a beef stew with dried chilies and cornbread, and a dried apple pie from the bushel of apples she found stored in the cold cellar. It was not fancy, but it was good and hot and plentiful, and when the hands filed into the cookhouse that evening, smelling of horses and sweat and the day's labor, they ate with the concentrated silence of men who were genuinely hungry and genuinely pleased by what was in front of them. She watched them from the kitchen doorway without being obvious about it. Counting heads, learning faces. Pete she already knew. There was a tall, quiet man named Garrison who had silver at his temples and ate with careful, deliberate movements. There were two brothers named Ortega who argued with each other constantly and apparently found this entertaining. There was a red-faced, jovial man named Tucker who made a toast to good cooking with his coffee cup. There were others, young and old, weathered and fresh. And then there was one man who came in after the others, who sat at the far end of the long table nearest the door, and who did not look up when he sat down. He was perhaps 28 or 29, tall and lean in the way of men who moved constantly, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that was shadowed with several days of growth. His hands, she noticed when he reached for the bread, were scarred across the knuckles. He wore a battered dark hat that he did not remove when he came inside, which was against the custom of every other man at that table. He ate steadily and silently and alone, despite being surrounded by men. She did not stare. She went back to the kitchen and checked the pie. When the meal was over and the hands began filtering out, she came through with the coffee pot to refill cups. She worked her way down the table, making brief eye contact, nodding when someone thanked her, keeping moving. When she reached the end of the table, the dark-haired man had not left yet. He was sitting with both hands wrapped around his coffee cup, looking at something in the middle distance that no one else could see. "More coffee?" she asked. He looked up. His eyes were green, which she had not expected on a man so otherwise dark in coloring. Not a bright green, but a deep, complicated one like creek water over shaded rock. "Thank you," he said. She poured. He watched the coffee with those odd eyes. She started to move away. "The stew was good," he said, not looking up again. "Better than what we have been eating the past 3 weeks. What have you been eating the past 3 weeks? The corner of his mouth moved, very slightly. It might have been the beginning of something like a smile, or it might have been nothing at all. "Hard to say," he said. "Whatever it was not this." She took that as a compliment and moved on. That night she lay in her narrow bed off the kitchen and listened to the great quiet of the Texas dark, which was a different quality of quiet than any she had known before. There were night birds and distant cattle and the slow groan of the barn in a light wind, and underneath all of it, a vast, pressing silence that felt almost alive. She decided she liked that too. The next morning she was up at 4:30 to have the stove going and the bacon frying and the biscuits in the oven before the hands stirred. She had learned from her years at the boarding house that a cook who was late was a cook who was disrespected, and she had no intention of earning either reputation. She had coffee ready before anyone had their boots on. Pete came in first, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and stopped when he smelled the bacon. "Lord," he said reverently. The others followed. Tucker was boisterous as ever. The Ortega brothers continued their ongoing argument in a mix of Spanish and English. Garrison sat quietly in the same seat as the night before. She moved efficiently among them, filling plates and refilling coffee and making mental notes about preferences. Tucker liked extra biscuits. Garrison did not take sugar. One of the younger hands could not tolerate spice in the mornings, which she filed away for future reference. Cole Merritt came in last again, and sat at the end of the table again, and this time she noticed that the seat closest to him on either side remained empty, though the rest of the table was full. She brought his plate without waiting for him to ask. He looked up when she set it down. "You remember what I take," he said. "I remembered everyone's plate," she said simply, and moved on. She felt his eyes follow her back to the kitchen. She did not turn around. It was Tucker who told her the fuller version of Cole Merritt's story, though he came at it sideways, in the way of men who want to talk about something without seeming like they are gossiping. He lingered over his second cup of coffee the morning of her second day, while the others had gone to work, and Elara was rolling dough for that evening's pie. "You seem like a sensible woman," Tucker said, with the air of a man about to say something he suspected she would ignore. "I like to think so," she said. "Then I will just say it plain. Cole Merritt, the man at the end of the table." She kept rolling. "I know who you mean. He is—" Tucker turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He has a past, Miss Voss. Not the normal kind of cowhand past where a man did some wild things when he was young and settled. He has the other kind." "What other kind is that?" "The kind where the wildness did not go away. He came to us from a ranch up in the Panhandle, north of here, and the foreman there wrote to Mr. Caldwell and said he was the best cattleman he had ever employed, but that he had put 2 men in the infirmary during his time there. Not unprovoked," Tucker added quickly, because he was fundamentally fair. "Both times the other men started it and most people agreed they had it coming, but still. A man who puts other men in the infirmary carries something in him that most people would rather not be near." Elara pressed the heel of her palm into the dough. "Was there trouble since he came here?" "Not physical trouble. No, he keeps to himself mostly. But there was an incident in town couple of months ago. Saloon situation. A gambler made some remark that nobody quite heard clearly, and Cole walked him out of the saloon by his collar, and the gambler did not come back to Dusty Creek after that." "Did he hurt the man?" Tucker considered. "Not enough to count, I suppose, but it was the look on his face that stayed with people. Like there was something underneath the surface of him that was a very long way down and dark, and you did not want to know what was at the bottom of it." Elara folded the dough over and pressed again. "I appreciate you telling me," she said, because she did, genuinely. "I will be careful." Tucker nodded, satisfied. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and went back out to work, and Elara stood at the table with flour on her hands and thought that the description of Cole Merritt sounded less like a villain and more like a man who carried a very heavy thing. She was not wrong, as it turned out. The incident that changed the shape of everything happened on the 3rd day. She had been to the garden plot at the side of the main house to gather what early greens were coming up, because she wanted to make a proper salad to go alongside the pork she had been slow cooking all day. The garden was not yet in its full spring abundance, but there were young onions and radishes and some lettuce that had wintered well. She was crouched among the rows with her basket when she heard the argument start somewhere near the corral. She could not hear the words clearly at first, only the shape of voices raised. Then she heard a crash, which was the sound of something heavy hitting a fence, and she stood up and looked around the corner of the house. There were 3 men at the corral. 2 of them she did not know particularly well, young hands who had been with the ranch longer than she had but whose names she was still sorting out. They were big, both of them, and they were standing very close to Cole Merritt in a way that had nothing casual about it. She could see from where she stood that one of them was holding a coil of rope, and the other had a shovel handle in his hand, which he was smacking against his palm in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Cole was standing with his back to the corral fence, and she saw in his posture exactly what Tucker had described, that stillness beneath the surface that contained quality like a river that looked calm while it ran fast and deep beneath. He was not afraid. That was clear. He was waiting. She did not hesitate. She walked toward them, and she walked loudly, her boot heels deliberate on the dry ground. All 3 men looked at her. "I need help in the garden," she said, addressing no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. in the tone she had perfected over years of managing difficult men in a boarding house. It was the tone of a woman who had not seen anything worth commenting on and expected compliance without drama. "One of you, at least. Those onion beds need turning." The two young men with the rope and the shovel handle looked at each other. Whatever spell had been building between the three of them broke like a thread pulled too tight. One of them muttered something and they both walked away, the rope still in hand, the shovel handle still swinging. Cole Merritt looked at her. The green eyes were flat and still and measuring. "I do not actually need anyone's help," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "Are you all right?" He took a slow breath. "Those are not the first men who ever decided they did not like my company." I noticed. He looked at her for a long moment in the way that people rarely looked at each other in ordinary life, directly, without pretense or social smoothing. It was slightly unnerving and also entirely honest. "Miss Voss," he said. "Yes. You should probably listen to what people tell you about me." "I generally prefer to form my own opinions," she said. "I find other people's opinions are frequently more about themselves than about their subject." He said nothing to that, but something shifted in the flat green of his eyes, something small and unwilling, and she filed it away and went back to her onion beds. She told herself that evening, firmly and logically, that she was not developing an interest in a man who had already been described to her by no fewer than 3 different people as dangerous. She told herself this while she was stirring the gravy, and she told herself this again while she was slicing the bread, and she told herself this a third time while she was setting out the supper dishes. And by the third time she knew she was lying to herself, which was irritating. She had always been an honest woman. She preferred to apply that honesty inward too. The truth was simple enough. He interested her, not in spite of the warnings but in part because of them. She had lived 23 years and she had met very few people who were exactly what they appeared to be on the surface, and Cole Merritt clearly had more surfaces than most. She was curious. That was all. She would be sensible about it. This resolution lasted until he found her sitting on the back step of the cookhouse the following evening at dusk, after supper was cleaned up and the hands had dispersed, and he sat down on the step below her without asking permission and started talking. Not talking about anything important. That was the surprising part. He talked about the cattle, about the way the spring grass was coming in this year, and what it suggested about the coming summer. He talked about a particular stretch of creek on the North Range that he had been working alone all week, and how the cottonwoods along it were just beginning to come into leaf. He talked the way people talk when they have not talked in a very long time, and have suddenly found themselves with someone who seems willing to listen. She listened. She did not try to fill the silences. She had noticed that the silences did not make him uncomfortable, and she was not going to make them uncomfortable artificially. After a while he said, "Why did you come here?" "I needed work," she said. "There must be work in Kansas City." "There is. I did not want to stay in Kansas City." He turned and looked up at her from the lower step. "Why?" "My father died in January. Everything there reminded me of him, and I needed to be somewhere that did not." She had not said that plainly to anyone else since arriving. She was not sure why she said it to him. But there was something about the way he asked questions without pity, without the preparatory softness that people usually lay down before approaching grief, as though they needed to cushion themselves against it, that made honesty seem less effortful. "I understand that," he said, and the flatness in his voice was not indifference but something much older. "What was he like?" "Difficult," she said, and smiled slightly. "And funny when he wanted to be, and stubborn to a fault. He taught me to cook actually, which is not a thing most people expect when they hear that my father was the one who taught me. He was a better baker than my mother ever was, and she was no slouch." Cole was quiet for a moment. "My father taught me to rope," he said finally, "before he died." "How old were you?" 14. "That is young to lose a father." "It was," he said, with the simplicity of a man who had long since finished being surprised by that fact. "But he taught me everything I needed before he went. He was that kind of man, practical about things he could not change." She did not ask what he died of. She sensed that the offer of the information itself was the thing, not the details. They sat in the cooling dusk while the stars came out one by one over the Texas plain, and the cattle moved somewhere in the dark with their soft, distant sounds, and the light in the bunkhouse windows went yellow and warm. They sat there for perhaps an hour in total and talked about things that mattered and things that did not. And when she finally said she ought to go in and plan tomorrow's menu, he stood and stepped aside to let her pass and said, "Good night, Miss Voss," in a voice that was different from the one he used when he was being guarded. She noticed the difference and went inside and did not let herself dwell on it, mostly successfully. The following morning, Pete found her as she was hauling water from the pump to the stove, and he fell into step beside her with the air of a man conducting a diplomatic mission. "I noticed Cole sat with you on the step last evening," he said. "He did," she agreed. Did he was he Pete was choosing words carefully in a way that was clearly uncomfortable for him. Did he behave himself? She stopped and looked at Pete with the particular patience she reserved for situations that tested it. "He sat on a step and talked about cattle and cottonwood trees," she said. "If that constitutes misbehavior, your bar is very low," Pete colored. "I just want you to know that they are looking out for you is all. You are new here and you do not know him the way we do, and Pete," she said pleasantly, "I grew up managing a boarding house full of men who had various and colorful problems. I'm quite able to manage myself, and I would appreciate being trusted to do so." Pete looked slightly chastened. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went to help with morning chores. She felt a flicker of irritation that she was honest enough to examine. The irritation was not entirely at Pete and his well-meaning interference. Some of it was directed at herself, because she knew that Pete was not wrong, that she did not know Cole Merritt the way they did, and yet she found herself believing, with a certainty that was not yet fully explained by evidence, that what the other hand saw and what was actually there were not the same thing. She made a pot of extra strong coffee that morning and thought about it. What she knew about Cole Merritt was small but specific. He had lost his father young. He was exceptional at his work, by universal agreement. He had been in fights, but in both documented cases the provocation had come from others. He was difficult to be near in the way that very honest people are sometimes difficult to be near, because they do not pretend the social lubricants that make ordinary interaction smooth. He had no malice that she had seen. He had, in fact, shown her more genuine consideration in 4 days than most people showed her in a month, which was perhaps a low bar but was also simply true. She was thinking about this, still stirring the coffee she was not drinking, when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed for riding, hat on, and he had a cut along his cheekbone that was fresh and still a little swollen. He held up a hand before she could speak. "Pete," he said, which was all the explanation he offered. She blinked. "Pete did that. We had a disagreement." She stood up from the table. "Sit down," she said, already moving toward the cabinet where she kept the medicinal supplies, because a ranch kitchen was also inevitably a first aid station. "It does not need attention," he said. "Cole Merritt," she said, which was the first time she had used his name to him directly, and it stopped him, and she was mildly startled herself by how naturally it had come. "Sit down." He sat. She cleaned the cut with the efficiency of long practice, aware that he was very still under her hands and that he was looking at the kitchen wall rather than at her, with the determined focus of a man who was choosing not to notice something. She was aware of the fact that she was standing very close to him in order to do what she was doing, and that he smelled of hay and horses and open air, and that he was, up close, a man who would be described by any objective observer as handsome in a weathered and unconventional way. She was also aware that noting this was not helping her be sensible. "What did you and Pete disagree about?" she asked, to give herself something to concentrate on. A pause. She stopped cleaning the cut. He still did not look at her. "Pete told me to keep my distance from you," he said in the flat voice. "He said it was for your benefit. I told him his opinion of what was for your benefit was not one I had asked for. He was less polite after that." "And then?" she asked, because the cut on his cheek had clearly not been the result of a vigorous conversation. "And then he took a swing at me," Cole said, with an inflection that suggested Pete had not found this exchange entirely in his favor either. She set down the cloth she had been using. She stood back and looked at him properly. "You did not tell him to keep his opinions to himself because you disagreed with his assessment," she said slowly, thinking it through. "You told him that because you thought his right to hold that opinion about me was not his to exercise, because you thought that was my decision." The green eyes came to her face. "Yes," he said. "That is a very particular distinction," she said. "I know it," he said. She felt the thing between them that had been a distant hum for 4 days become something louder and closer. She felt it with perfect clarity, and she acknowledged it internally without drama, because she was an honest woman. "You should finish getting ready to ride," she said. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes." He stood. He looked at her for one more moment with those Creekwater eyes, and then he went to the door, and then he stopped. "Miss Voss," he said, "I would like, if it is agreeable to you, to sit with you on the step again this evening." She did not let herself smile where he could see it. "I usually sit there around 7, she said, "if I have the dishes done." "I will be there at 7, he said, and left. She let herself smile then, standing alone in the kitchen with the sun coming through the window and the coffee going cold in the pot. The conversation that evening began where the previous one had left off and ranged outward from there with the kind of ease that normally takes years of acquaintance to build, and that was building itself, between the two of them, in a matter of days. They talked about books, because she had brought 3 with her, and he had 2 of his own in the bunkhouse, a battered copy of a scientific text about animal husbandry, and a novel by Twain that he had read 4 times. They talked about what they had seen of the country, which for her was limited but for him ranged considerably wider, because he had drifted since the age of 16, following cattle work up and down the Central Plains. "Where did you grow up?" she asked. "Missouri mostly," he said. "Small town, nothing much to say about it. Family, mother remarried when I was 15. Her husband and I did not get along. I left." He said it without self-pity and without the invitation for sympathy that people sometimes attach to such statements to generate a particular response. It was simply a thing that had happened, laid flat for her to look at or not. "Has it been better," she asked, "being out here?" He considered this with more care than most people would give it. "In some ways," he said. "I understand land. I understand cattle. I understand working hard at something and watching it come right. I am good at what I do, and that matters to me. The part that is not better is the moving around. You stop collecting people to care about after a while because caring and leaving is worse than either one alone." She was quiet for a moment. "And yet here you are, 8 months at one place," she said. He looked at her sideways. 8 months, he agreed, "which is the longest I have stayed in 7 years. She absorbed this. The night was warm and still, and somewhere far out on the plain there was a coyote calling, the sound like a thread of silver in the dark. "Why?" she asked. "I am not sure I knew until recently," he said. She did not press him on what recently meant, though she was fairly certain she understood it. Over the next 2 days the pattern set itself firmly into place. She cooked and he worked, and in the evenings they sat on the step and talked, and gradually the distance between them, the physical distance, the careful formal distance that propriety required began to narrow without either of them doing anything so deliberate as deciding to narrow it. It was simply that the world contracted around the two of them in the evenings, reduced itself to this porch step and this quiet and this conversation, and everything outside that circle became less immediate. She was aware that people were watching. Pete had grown quieter and more careful around her, in the way of a young man who knows he has overstepped and is not sure how to correct the overstepping. Tucker watched with bright, speculative eyes and the expression of a man who finds the situation entertaining. Garrison, who said very little, gave her a brief nod of his silver head one morning that she thought, possibly, was a form of approval. Harold Caldwell said nothing. He watched things on his ranch with the sharp peripheral attention of a man who had run a large operation for 30 years, and he saw everything, but he was not a man who spoke unnecessarily. On the 6th day, Cole found her in the barn. She had gone there looking for the cat that kept the mice under control, whose name was apparently General Grant, because one of the older hands had named her and she was enough in command of the barn to justify it. She had made a custard with the last of the stored eggs and thought the cat deserved a portion. She was crouched in the straw near the hay bales, calling softly when Cole came in from the far door, leading his horse after an afternoon of working the North Range. He saw her and stopped. "Lost," he said. "Looking for the general," she said. "I have brought her something." He almost smiled more than the almost of that first night, broader and less reluctant. He put the horse in its stall and went to the corner behind the grain barrels and made a low sound with his mouth. And General Grant appeared immediately, which said something about his relationship with the barn's resident authority. The cat came to Elara's offered dish and ate with dignified efficiency, while Cole leaned against the stall door and watched with his arms crossed, and that expression on his face that she was learning to read, the one that looked like distance from outside, but from where she was standing looked quite a bit like contentment. "You have lived here long enough to know where the cat hides," she observed. "I sleep better in the barn sometimes," he said, and then, because she waited without reacting, added, "The bunkhouse is loud, men snoring and talking in their sleep. In the barn it is just the horses." "That makes sense," she said. "Does not make people look at you less strangely," he said. "People look at you strangely regardless, from what I can tell," she said. "You might as well sleep where you like." General Grant finished the custard and sat down to wash her face with her paw, clearly done with both of them. Cole was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Elara." It was the first time he had used her name, the way she had used his that morning in the kitchen with the cut on his cheek. The way it landed in the quiet of the barn was different from any of the ways her name had been said to her by anyone else in her life, which was information she received and stored without letting it alter her expression. "Yes," she said. "I need to tell you some things," he said, "so that you are not hearing them second or third or fourth hand and through the particular filter of people who have never asked me my side of them." She straightened and looked at him properly. "All right," she said, he told her. Not all of it at once and not apologetically, but directly, in the flat, honest voice that she had come to understand was his natural register when he was not guarding himself. He told her about the 2 men he had put in the infirmary at the ranch to the north. One had been a matter of a man who had decided to test him with his fists, which Cole had declined to lose. The other had been more serious, a cowhand who had taken a cruelty to a horse that Cole had witnessed and could not leave unaddressed. The man had not been badly hurt but had complained to everyone who would listen, and the story that traveled was not the whole story. He told her about the gambler in the saloon in Dusty Creek, and that part of the story was simpler than Tucker had made it. The gambler had been cheating with marked cards and Cole had seen it and said so, and the gambler had responded with language about Cole's parentage and general character that was not worth repeating, and Cole had walked him to the door by his collar and suggested he find another town to work, and the gambler had taken the suggestion. There was no violence, only the credible implication of it, which was its own kind of tool. He told her about his time on the ranch up north, where he had been well regarded by the foreman and poorly regarded by a subset of the hands, who did not appreciate a man who would not socialize on their terms or drink until he was incapable. He told her about Pete and the morning they fought, which she already knew most of, but he filled in the part she had not known, that Pete had been going around to the other hands all week telling them that she needed to be protected from Cole, which was a thing Cole had heard about, and which he had not been able to let stand without saying something, because Pete was inserting himself into a situation that was not his to manage. When he was done he said, "I am not a good man in the conventional way. I do not pretend to be. I have a temper that I manage better than I used to, but that, I will not lie to you and say, is entirely under control. I have made enemies and I have had fights and I have left places that I should have left before they ended, but I have never hurt anyone who did not bring it to me first, and I have never lied to anyone who trusted me, and I have never made a promise I did not keep." She looked at him for a long while in the warm barn air. General Grant was asleep on the hay bale now, perfectly indifferent to all human complications. "That is more than most people can say," Elara said finally. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on him, something naked and uncertain. "Is it enough?" he asked. She understood that this was a larger question than the sentence contained. "It is more than enough," she said. The thing between them, which had been building since the night of the second supper, and which had been accelerating since the morning in the kitchen with the cloth and the cut, arrived now at a place it could not remain without becoming something formally acknowledged. They stood in the barn with the horses moving softly behind him, and the sunlight coming through the slat windows, and the smell of hay and warm leather and plain, honest Texas summer. And they looked at each other with the complete attention of two people who have seen each other clearly, and found the seeing worth the risk of continuing. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and she did not move away, and he took her face in his scarred hands with a gentleness entirely at odds with the rough surface of them, and he kissed her with a directness that was his natural mode in all things, not tentative, not aggressive, but clear and certain and unhurried, with the quality of a man who knows what he is doing and intends to do it well. She kissed him back with equal directness because she was the same kind of person in her own particular fashion. When they stepped apart, she said, "That was probably not sensible." "No," he agreed, and the real smile came then, the one that changed the entire architecture of his face, that made him look his actual age instead of 10 years older, that made something in her chest tighten pleasantly and alarmingly. It was not sensible at all. She gathered General Grant's dish from the straw and walked back toward the kitchen, and behind her she heard him begin brushing down his horse, and she was smiling the entire way across the yard. That evening Harold Caldwell stopped her as she was crossing between the cookhouse and the main house and said, without preamble, in his direct cattle buyer's way, "I am not blind, Miss Voss." "I know you are not, Mr. Caldwell," she said. He looked at the middle distance, which was his custom when he was making calculations. "Cole Merritt is a complicated man," he said. "So everyone tells me," she said pleasantly. "He is also a reliable one," Harold said, which she had not expected from him. "Which is a rarer and more valuable quality. I have employed a great many men, and the ones who are reliable are worth 10 of the merely agreeable ones." He brought his gaze back to her. "You are an adult woman, and you do not require my opinion on how you conduct your personal life. I am only saying that if this goes the way it appears to be going, I will not stand in its way, and neither will my ranch." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she said. He nodded once and went back inside, and that was the most Harold Caldwell ever said on the subject, which was more than enough. Cole came to supper and ate at the end of the table as usual, but something was different, and the other hands felt it without being able to name it clearly. He was different in some way that they could see but not quite explain, less separate, perhaps, or more present in the room, or simply more at ease in a way that read as different to people who were accustomed to his particular brand of contained tension. Tucker looked between the two of them and said nothing, but his expression was the expression of a man who has correctly predicted the weather. After supper she was washing dishes and he appeared in the kitchen doorway, not unusual now, and leaned his shoulder against the frame, which was also not unusual, and then he said something that was entirely unusual. "I would like to speak to Mr. Caldwell," he said. "In the morning." She kept washing the pan she was working on. Her hands were very steady. "About what?" she asked. "About the possibility of building a house," he said, "on the north quarter where the cottonwoods are. There is a piece of land that is not currently being used for grazing, and I have 8 months of wages that have mostly been sitting untouched because I have not had occasion to spend them." She set the pan down slowly and turned around. He was watching her with those green eyes and that new quality of certainty that he had not quite had before the barn. "Cole," she said. "I know it has been 6 days," he said, in the preemptive way of a man who expects to be told he is moving too fast and has decided to address the objection before it is made. "I know that by any ordinary measure that is not enough time to." He stopped and started again. "I have spent a great deal of time in my life knowing something was true and not being willing to say it plainly. I am tired of that. I know what I know." "What do you know?" she asked. "I know that I want to stay," he said. "Not in the bunkhouse, not in the barn. I know that I want to build something here with someone and be the kind of man who has a home to come back to at the end of the day. And I know that you are the reason I want that, not the idea of it." He looked at her directly. "I am not asking you to make a decision tonight. I am telling you where I am so you know." She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and walked to where he was standing in the doorway and looked up at him in the lamplight, and she said, "Ask me." He understood what she meant. She could see it in his face. "Elara Voss," he said, quietly and without ceremony and with more sincerity than she had ever heard in a question before, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He exhaled, and it was the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding for a very long time. He reached out and took her hand and held it just that, stood in the kitchen doorway with her hand in his and the night behind him and the lamplight between them, and the moment settled into something solid and permanent. "They told Mr. Caldwell in the morning." He listened to Cole's plan about the house and the land and his intention to continue working the ranch as senior hand, with the arrangement modified to account for a wife and eventually a household. Harold looked at his rough, scarred boots for a long time and then said, "The North Quarter land is not in use and will not be. If you can build on it and maintain your responsibilities, it is yours for the labor." He paused. "And for what it is worth, I believe Miss Voss has more sense than to make a poor choice." Cole looked at the older man, and something passed between them that Elara could see but not quite name. The look of a younger man receiving something in the vicinity of a benediction. There was a church in Dusty Creek. The Reverend was a practical man named Holt who had performed ceremonies for cowboys and schoolteachers and ranchers and traveling merchants, and he did not require long engagements or extensive planning. He required a willing couple and 2 witnesses and the proper reading, and he could do it on any day that was not already spoken for. Sunday was not spoken for. Pete came to Cole on Saturday, hat in hand in the literal sense, standing outside the bunkhouse with an expression that was the expression of a young man who has examined himself and found himself wanting and is attempting to do something about it. "I am sorry," he said to Cole, without preamble. "About what I said to her and what I said to you. He searched for the word. I was doing it for the wrong reasons, not her reasons. Mine." Cole looked at him for a long moment. "What were your reasons?" he asked. Pete's face went red. I thought I might." He stopped. "It does not matter. It was not right to put myself in the middle of something that was not about me." Cole regarded him for another beat and then said, "Apology accepted." It was not warm, but it was genuine, which was Cole's way. He stuck out his hand and Pete shook it, and the thing between them was done. Elara heard about this from Tucker, who had witnessed it and reported it with the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed seeing the smaller dramas of human nature resolve themselves correctly. On Sunday morning, she put on the best dress she had, which was a deep blue wool that her mother had made for her 2 years before, and she pinned her brown hair up carefully and looked at herself in the small mirror over the washstand and decided she looked like herself, which was the best she could offer. They rode into Dusty Creek in the ranch wagon, she and Cole and Harold Caldwell, who had agreed to witness, and Tucker, who had been asked by Cole with a brevity that Tucker found hilarious and touching in equal measure. The Reverend's wife played the church's small and slightly flat organ. The Reverend read the words in a plain, unhurried voice that suited the occasion perfectly. She stood beside Cole in the church with the morning light coming through the windows, and when the Reverend said the words she said yes to, she said them clearly and without hesitation, looking up at Cole's face, which was the most serious and the most unguarded she had ever seen it. He said his words back to her in the quiet voice that was his real voice, not the flat, guarded one. And when he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that he had ridden into town to the jeweler for on Friday without telling her, which she had only learned after the fact from Tucker, she felt it settle there with a weight that was entirely right. Reverend Holt said, "You may kiss your bride," and Cole did, briefly and properly in the church setting, with the restraint of a man who understood the difference between public and private. But she felt in that brief contact the promise of the private, and she was content. After the ceremony they stood outside in the spring sunshine, and Harold Caldwell shook Cole's hand and patted Elara's once, and then got back in the wagon to return to the ranch, because he was a practical man, and the cattle did not take a day off for sentiment. Tucker wrung Cole's hand and kissed Elara on the cheek, and declared the whole business the best thing to happen in Dusty Creek in years, which may or may not have been true but was pleasantly said. Pete was not there. She had not invited him and would not have, but she heard later that he had stood outside the church during the ceremony, sitting on the church's hitching post rail, and that he had not looked unhappy exactly, but rather the way young men look when they understand that something they briefly imagined will not be theirs, and that this is simply the ordinary weather of a life. She was not unsympathetic. She had been 23 once, and she still was, for that matter, and she understood the particular sting of certain realizations. But she could not manage his feelings for him, and she suspected he would find his way. They drove back to the ranch in a second wagon that Cole had borrowed and decorated, minimally but deliberately, with some cedar branches that he had cut fresh that morning and laid in the bed. She sat beside him on the bench seat with the Texas sky opening up above them, and the spring grass coming in green around the trail and his shoulder warm and solid against hers, and she thought that the world had changed completely in 1 week in a way that felt, paradoxically, like the most stable thing that had ever happened to her. "I do not think anyone has ever married someone in quite such a short time," she said. "I have heard of shorter," he said. "Have you?" "Man I knew in Abilene married a woman 3 days after they met," he said. "They had 6 children last I heard." "Is that supposed to make me feel better about the pace of our acquaintance?" she asked. "It was supposed to make you feel that 6 days is, comparatively, thoroughly researched," he said, and she laughed, which was the sound that she discovered made his whole body relax beside her, the tension he carried in his shoulders easing away as though her laughter was something that the tension could not coexist with. She filed this away carefully, because a woman who knows what her husband needs is better equipped than one who has to guess. The house took 3 months to build. Cole designed it himself on paper, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with a lamp and a pencil, showing her the plans with the careful attention of a man who wants his partner's input and is not just saying so. She modified things. The kitchen needed to be larger. There needed to be a proper pantry. She wanted a window on the south wall for light in the afternoons. He incorporated every change without argument, and often with suggestions that improved on hers. He built it with the help of 2 of the older hands who were carpenters by background, and who were willing to give their Sundays to the project in exchange for a share of the glory and a great deal of Elara's cooking. Harold Caldwell contributed lumber from a supply he had been storing for a barn extension, as a wedding gift, with the gruffness of a man who does not want his generosity to be commented upon. She kept cooking for the ranch all through this period, which suited her fine. The routine was hers now, the kitchen was hers, the whole system of the ranch's daily meals was organized to her specifications, and she ran it with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has found her place in a thing and occupied it fully. She had also, in the first weeks after the wedding, made the effort of learning the name and preference of every single hand on the payroll, which earned her a loyalty that went beyond the ordinary loyalty a cook earns for feeding people well. Even Pete, who remained careful and slightly formal with her for some weeks, eventually softened to something more ordinary. He was a good young man underneath the mistake of his interference, and she did not hold things longer than they deserved to be held. She and Cole fell into the patterns of a marriage, with a naturalness that she had not known to expect. They talked in the evenings as they had done from the start, only now the evenings were longer and more various, because there was always something to discuss: the house's progress, the ranch's affairs, the small dailiness of a life being constructed. She learned that he made coffee strong enough to startle and preferred his badly. She learned that he was a light sleeper and that the nighttime quiet of the bunkhouse had never truly been enough. She learned that he had a laugh that was rare but, when it came, was genuine to the bone, not polished or performed but entirely real. He learned that she was fearless about most things but had a sincere and fully formed terror of rattlesnakes, which was not unreasonable in Texas, but which he found worthy of very gentle handling. He learned that she read before sleeping every night without exception, and that taking a book away from her before she was ready to put it down was the closest thing to a genuine conflict she was capable of. He learned that she had opinions about whether not complaints but actual considered opinions, as though the weather were a subject worth studying, and that she was nearly always right about what was coming. In October, they moved into the house. It stood on the north quarter of the Caldwell land, in the shade of the cottonwoods Cole had described the first time he told her what he knew, with a porch that faced east for the morning sun, and a kitchen window that faced south as she had asked, and a bedroom that was in the quietest corner. It was not large by any standard, and it was not elaborate, but it was solid and true and built to last. And when she walked through it that first day and touched the walls and stood in the kitchen where the stove was already installed and looked out the south wind, at the land, she felt something she had been looking for since January without knowing quite what shape it was in. Cole stood in the doorway watching her, and she turned and found his face. "It is right," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She continued cooking for the ranch, riding back each morning in the light, returning in the evening to her kitchen that was hers and her table that was theirs, and her husband who came in from the range at supper with the smell of cattle and open air about him, and kissed her with the same directness and certainty he had employed from the beginning. He was not a demonstrative man in public. The other hands had rarely seen anything more than a hand at her back or a brief look. But in private, he was the most deliberately attentive person she had ever known, the kind of man who noticed things and acted on the noticing, who remembered what she said and incorporated it, who looked at her as though she were the most interesting feature of whatever room they were in. The winter was cold and the work was unrelenting, as Texas winter ranch work always was. There were cattle to be managed and fences to be mended, and the constant commerce of a large operation with its demands and emergencies. Cole took on more responsibility as the senior hand, and Harold leaned on him increasingly, which Cole took in stride with a competence that was not surprising to Elara, but which she saw genuinely surprised some of the hands who had been wary of him. Pete was among these. She watched the relationship between Pete and Cole develop slowly across the winter months, from the awkward aftermath of their conflict into something that, by spring, had the shape of a genuine and uncomplicated working partnership. Pete was talented with horses, and Cole recognized talent without being resentful of it, which was a quality that went far in a bunkhouse. By April they were working the South Range together without friction, and sometimes she saw them talking at the end of the day in the way of men who have arrived, without discussing it, at a mutual regard. She told Cole this one evening, and he said, "Pete is a better man than he knows, when he is not convinced he has a reason to be worse." "That is a fairly kind thing to say about someone you fought," she observed. "We both knew why we were fighting and what we were fighting about," he said. Once those things were resolved, there was no reason for the fighting to keep existing. "I think you are more perceptive about people than you let on," she said. "I am quiet," he said. "Quiet people have time to watch." "Is that how you are perceptive? You simply watch?" "Mostly," he said, "and I watch people who watch well." He looked at her with the plain directness that was his natural manner between them. "You are the best observer of people I have ever met. You know everyone on this ranch better than they know themselves. That might be somewhat overstated, she said, but she was pleased by it. It is not, he said, and the matter was settled to his satisfaction. In the late spring she realized, with a mixture of awe and terror and profound joy, that she was going to have a baby. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Cole, not because she intended to keep it from him, but because she needed the time to become familiar with it herself first. On the 4th day she told him over supper, simply and directly, in the way they did everything. He put down his fork very carefully and looked at her. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing, and she loved him very specifically for that being the first thing. "I am entirely well," she said. "I am," she stopped, because the feeling required more vocabulary than she had immediately available. "I am very happy about it, if you are." "Elara," he said, in the voice that was only ever used for things that mattered. "There is not a large enough word for what I am." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he held it without speaking for a long time, and outside the window the evening light lay gold across the Texas grass, and it was one of those moments that a person knows, even while it is happening, they will carry as long as they live. The summer was the fullest and richest she had known. She slowed by necessity as the months passed, handing more of the ranch cooking to a young woman from town who Harold hired to assist. Cole became, without discussion, a man of very particular attentiveness, not fussing, which she would not have tolerated, but attentive in practical ways, in the way of a man who has identified something precious and intends to treat it accordingly. He modified the height of the kitchen shelves so she did not have to stretch. He added a second step to the porch because she said the single step was awkward. He rode back from the ranch at noon more often than he had before, for no stated reason, and she did not point this out because she did not want to give him the opportunity to be self-conscious about it. The baby came at the end of September, which was, to Elara, a perfect month for the arrival of important things. The Reverend Holt's wife, who served as the settlement's midwife, came and was steady and capable, and Cole was banished from the room in the traditional fashion and sat on the porch in the particular agony of a man who does not deal well with being unable to do anything useful. And he listened to the sounds from the bedroom without speaking to Tucker, who had appeared at the house from the ranch for reasons of his own, and was now sitting on the porch railing being not useful in a different way. The baby was a boy. He was born strong and loud and immediately inconvenienced by the whole situation, which Cole said later was a character that appeared to have been present from the first breath. They named him James, for Cole's father, and William for Elara's, and James William Merritt announced his opinions about the world from his first day in it with a vigor and a volume that suggested he had a great many of them. Cole held his son for the first time with the same stillness he brought to everything important, and looked at the baby's face with the expression of a man who has discovered a thing he did not know was possible until it was in his hands. He looked up at Elara over the baby's head, and she saw in his face everything she needed to see: the wonder and the certainty and the profound, uncomplicated love. "James William Merritt," Cole said softly, as though testing the name in the room. "That is a name with some weight to it." "He seems to like it," she said, because the baby had stopped complaining the moment Cole spoke. "He has good taste," Cole said, and she laughed. Harold Caldwell came to the house 2 days later to see the baby, alone, which was unusual for him. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hand and looked at the child Elara held, and then looked at Cole, and he said, "Your father was a good man, from what I heard of him. I think he would be pleased." He did not elaborate, and he did not need to. Cole said, "Thank you, Harold." It was the first time she had heard him use the older man's given name, and Harold Caldwell received it without comment, but with a slight relaxing around the eyes that was his equivalent of a smile. Pete came on the Sunday with a carved wooden horse that he had made himself, which he presented to the baby with the awkwardness of a young man who has made something with genuine effort and is not sure how it will be received. It was beautifully made. The horse had a mane carved in detail and a small saddle that was proportionally correct, and Cole held it and turned it over in his hands and said, "Pete, this is remarkable," in the plain, truthful way that could not be mistaken for politeness. Pete turned red but straightened noticeably. "I do some carving in the winter evenings," he said. "It gives your hands something to do." "You should sell these," Elara said. "People would buy them." "I am serious." Pete laughed, still red. "Maybe someday," he said. But she saw him turn the idea over in his mind as he left, and she thought someday was probably right. The baby grew, and the house settled into itself, and the seasons turned. Cole's reputation on the ranch shifted gradually, the way reputations do when time fills in the picture that first impressions left incomplete. He was still not a man who socialized easily or who made himself agreeable for the sake of being agreeable. He was still frank to a fault, and quiet by nature, and disinclined to pretend. But the hands who worked beside him learned, as Elara had learned, that what sat underneath the difficult surface was a person of genuine reliability, someone who did what he said he would do, who stood by what he stood for, who did not vary in the things that mattered between the days when things were easy and the days when they were not. That particular quality became visible in a practical way the following spring, when a late-season ice storm came through with 3 days' warning, and Cole organized the entire ranch's response, getting the cattle to shelter, securing the outbuildings, ensuring the older hands had adequate supply, with a calm efficiency that later Harold would tell people was the difference between a significant loss and a manageable one. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a week of cold, difficult work, and Cole simply did it, and the ranch came through intact. Elara, who had kept the fire going for 3 days and fed everyone who came through the house and organized the supply of firewood with the same quiet precision Cole brought to the cattle, received her own proportion of the credit from Garrison, who said to her over coffee when the ice had melted, "You are a good pair, you two. Better together than either would be separately." "That is generally the idea," she said. "Not always the outcome," Garrison said, which was true enough. By the second summer James was walking, and had opinions about everything he could reach, which was an increasing range as his legs lengthened. He had Cole's coloring, the dark hair, the green eyes that surprised everyone who saw them in a toddler's face, but Elara's stubborn, direct manner, and the combination made him a thoroughly engaged and engaging small person who was universally liked on the ranch. Cole, who had never been demonstrative in public, made an exception for James, which the other hands witnessed without comment, and which Tucker described privately to Elara as the most humanizing thing he had ever seen a man do without knowing he was doing it. "He does not know how he looks," Tucker told her, "when he puts that boy on his shoulders and walks the fence line. Like something in him that has always been locked up finally found the key." She smiled at Tucker and said nothing, because she did not need to. The second child came 2 years after the first, a daughter they named Clara Rose, and where James had announced himself with volume and conviction, Clara came into the world with a studying quietness, looking around her from her first hours as though the situation was interesting and she was taking notes. She had Elara's brown hair and eyes and her grandmother's nose, which was a thing Elara discovered she could identify from a photograph, and which made her heart catch every time she looked at her daughter's face in the particular warm way that grief, at a long enough distance, becomes something bearable and even sweet. Cole held Clara with the same stillness he had held James, but with an added quality that Elara could only describe as absolute devastation, in the best possible sense. A man undone by a daughter in the way that men sometimes are, not in loss but in abundance. "She is looking at me," he said, in a voice she had never heard from him before, lower and more defenseless. "She looks at everything that way," Elara said. "I think she is like you, she is studying." He looked up at her over the baby's head, and his face was completely open in a way that it had taken a long time for her to earn and that she valued beyond anything she could name. "I never thought I would have this," he said. "Any of it, the house, you, them." He was quiet for a moment. "I was not sure I was the kind of man who could have it." "You were always the kind of man who could have it," she said. "You just needed someone to decline to believe otherwise." He laughed, the real laugh, the rare and entirely genuine one. And Clara startled at the sound and then settled, recognizing already, 3 hours into the world, the particular safety of that voice. Harold Caldwell retired from active management of the ranch in Cole's 4th year at Caldwell. His health had not been poor exactly, but it had become increasingly inconvenient, in the way of a man of 62 who has spent 4 decades in the Texas, whether doing physical work, and who has arrived at the point where his body is making its accounting. He retired to the main house and engaged his nephew from San Antonio to take over the business operations. Cole was offered the position of full ranch foreman, which he accepted after one conversation with Elara, which went as follows. She asked him if it was what he wanted. He said it was. She said then they should accept it. He said it would mean more time and responsibility and less flexibility. She said she had not married him for flexibility. He looked at her with those green eyes for a long moment and then said yes, they would accept it. The nephew from San Antonio was a man named Whitfield who was good with numbers and less good with cattle and people, and he had the wisdom to recognize this and to lean on Cole accordingly. The arrangement worked. The ranch prospered. Cole's authority among the hands became formal to match the informal authority he had already held for some time. Pete was promoted to Cole's former senior hand position, which pleased Elara greatly. Pete had grown, over the years since their rocky beginning, into a man of genuine quality, patient with young hands, innovative with horses, and possessed of a carving sideline that had expanded, as she had predicted, into something that brought in a supplemental income he was privately pleased by. He had married a woman from town named Louisa in Cole and Elara's 3rd year on the ranch, and the 4 of them had developed a friendship that was easy and genuine, the kind built not on a common beginning, but on a common daily life shared in close proximity. James started school the year the schoolhouse in Dusty Creek hired a proper teacher, a young man from back east who had come to Texas with ideals and a trunk full of books, and who was, to Elara's considerable satisfaction, an excellent teacher. James was an indifferent student in mathematics and an exceptional one in reading, which his parents found entirely predictable and entirely characteristic. He preferred to be outside with the cattle, but came home with books tucked under his arm and read them at the table while ostensibly being finished with his supper, which Cole allowed without comment and Elara allowed while pretending not to see it. Clara, when she started school 3 years behind her brother, was exceptional in everything with the quiet efficiency of a child who finds the whole enterprise interesting rather than effortful. She was her father's daughter in this way, not in what she learned but in how she learned it, with the absolute attention of someone who wants to understand a thing rather than merely know it. The spring that Cole turned 35 and Elara turned 30, they sat on the porch of their house on a warm evening with the cottonwoods in full spring leaf above them, the children in bed, the ranch quiet beyond the fence. Elara had a book in her lap that she was not reading. Cole had his feet on the porch rail in the easy way of a man in his own place. The stars were beginning to come out over the Texas plain, and the air smelled of new grass and cedar and the good smell of the land they had lived on for 7 years. "I have been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about what it means to have built something," she said slowly, because she was constructing the thought as she went. "Not a house specifically, though that too, but a life, a whole context. When I came here I had nothing that constituted a context. I had a carpetbag and a letter and a skill set, and now," she looked out at the dark land, "now everything is in relation to everything else. The work and the place and you and the children and the people we know, it all connects. That is what I mean by context, a web of things that hold each other up." He was quiet for a while, which meant he was taking the thought seriously. "When I came here," he said, I was 30 pounds lighter in spirit at least. I was carrying 7 years of not being in one place long enough to matter to anyone or anything, and I had decided somewhere along the way that this was just the shape of my life, that the carrying was the life. He paused. It was not. I had just not found the place to put it down. And this was the place, she said. You were the place, he said simply. This came with you. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had done 1,000 times by now and which still felt, in the way of things deeply right, exactly correct. I would like a third child, she said. He turned his head and looked down at her. Would you? He said with a warmth that was also clearly in agreement. Eventually, she said, when Clara is a bit older, I think 3 is the right number for this house and this life. All right, he said, you agree without any argument. I like children, he said. I'm especially fond of ours. You are a surprising man in many ways, she said. You have told me this before, he said. It continues to be true. He kissed her forehead, the easy proprietary kiss of a man in his own life, and she settled further into his shoulder, and above them the Texas stars took their positions one by one in the enormous dark sky. Clara was 5 and James was 7 the fall that Harold Caldwell died. He went quietly in the main ranch house in his sleep, which was the end he deserved, and which the doctor confirmed was his heart simply arriving at its natural conclusion after a great many decades of hard use. He left the ranch to his nephew Whitfield in the legal sense, but he left instructions that Cole Merritt should retain his foreman's position for as long as the ranch operated, and that the North Quarter land should be formally deeded to the Merritt family, because Caldwell had never been a man who did not close his accounts properly. They buried him in the Dusty Creek churchyard, and half the county came, because Harold Caldwell had been in this part of Texas since before Dusty Creek had a name, and there were very few people in the region whose lives had not been touched by him in one way or another. Cole stood at the graveside in a good black coat that Elara had laid out for him, and held James's hand on one side and Clara's on the other, and did not speak beyond what was required, but his face told anyone who was reading it carefully that the loss was genuine. Afterward, at the ranch house where Elara had organized the funeral gathering with the help of Louisa and the schoolteacher's wife and 3 women from the church, she found Cole standing alone for a moment near the window that looked out toward the North Quarter. He was good to us, she said quietly. He was good to me before there was an us, Cole said, when there was not much reason for it. That is the kind of thing that marks a person. He turned from the window. I would like to name the third one Harold if it is a boy. She had not known yet whether there was a third one, but she looked at his face, and something inside her was certain enough. I think that is exactly right, she said. The third came in the spring as Cole had proposed, and she had chosen, a boy as it happened, who came into the world with a disposition that was immediately, startlingly serene. Where James had been loud and Clara had been studious, Henry Harold Merritt arrived and surveyed his surroundings with a placidity that made the midwife say she had never seen such a self-possessed infant, which was not a thing midwives generally had occasion to say. Cole held Henry in the first morning light and said, "He is like you in that way. He is already deciding what he thinks." "He is 3 hours old," Elara said, laughing. "Some people know early," Cole said, and looked at her, and she knew he meant something larger than infants. The days that followed the arrival of Henry became the fullest and most particular days of her life, not the most dramatic, not the most weighted, but the most full of the quality she had come to value above all others, which was substance. The house was loud with children, and the ranch was busy with the work of spring, and Cole came home in the evenings with the smell of horses and open air, and held her in the kitchen while the stew was cooking, and James set the table with the efficiency of a child who has been doing it since he could reach, and Clara sat at the table with a book, and Henry slept in the cradle near the stove in the warm kitchen air. She had come to Texas with a carpetbag and a letter, and a determination not to grieve herself to dust in a city that remembered all the wrong things. She had been warned by 4 separate people in her first 3 days about a man who sat at the end of a long table and looked at the middle distance and did not fit the shape of what people expected. She had formed her own opinion, which had taken approximately a week to become a certainty. She had married that certainty before the week was properly out, in the plain church in Dusty Creek on a Sunday morning, in a blue wool dress, with the light coming through the windows. She had not regretted it for a single day, not one. The spring that Henry was 2 and Clara was 7, and James turned 9, Cole came home from the North Range one afternoon with a collie pup that one of the hands had found in the creek brush, apparently abandoned or lost, and that had followed his horse back to the fence with the single-minded determination of a creature that has decided where its life will be. He came to the kitchen door with the pup under his arm, and Elara turned from the stove and looked at it and then at him, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who knows he is probably in negotiation and has come prepared. "It followed me," he said. "I can see that," she said. "It has nowhere else to be," he said. "It appears to have decided it has somewhere to be," she said. "It has good judgment," he said. She looked at the dog, which looked at her with the complete confidence of a creature that has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the human parties to catch up. "The children will be intolerable about it," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Fine," she said, and turned back to the stove, and the dog settled under the kitchen table as though it had always been there. And Cole hung his hat by the door and washed his hands at the basin and stood beside her while she cooked, one hand on the small of her back, in the easy language of people who have been together long enough to know where each other's hands belong. James came in first from the yard, stopped, saw the dog, and dropped to the floor beside it with the undignified joy of a 9-year-old presented with an animal. Clara came in behind him, assessed the situation, determined that the dog appeared structurally sound and of acceptable temperament, and sat down to make its acquaintance with the same methodical approach she brought to everything. Henry, who was being carried in from the garden by Pete, who had stopped by, saw the dog from Pete's arms and made the sound of a child who needs to be set down immediately. Pete set him down. Henry reached the dog in 4 running steps and fell on it with the comprehensive love of a 2-year-old who has no intermediate setting. The dog accepted all of this with a patience that confirmed its good judgment. Pete leaned in the doorway with the look of a man watching something he will remember. "You know," he said to Elara conversationally, "when I told you about Cole Merritt that first day in the wagon, I was not even close to right about him." "I know you were not," she said. "I was right that he was complicated," Pete offered. "Everything worth having is complicated," she said. Pete considered this, then nodded. He looked at the scene in the kitchen, the dog and the children and Cole at the stove's edge with his hand on his wife's back, and he said, "I think you were brave." "I was not brave," she said. "I was just paying attention to the right things. Is there a difference?" She thought about this seriously, because Pete had earned a serious answer. "Maybe not," she said. "Maybe paying attention to the right things is the bravest thing there is. You have to choose which things you believe, and that is always a risk." He went home to Louisa shortly after that, and the kitchen settled into its evening routine of cooking and noise, and the particular bright chaos of a household with 3 children and a dog who had adopted them all. Cole sat at the table that evening with Henry on his knee, while Elara served supper, and James was telling a story about something that had happened at school with the elaborate narrative style of a 9-year-old who has his father's delivery and his mother's vocabulary. And Clara was quietly and systematically eating everything on her plate with the efficiency of a child who has plans for her evening and does not intend to be detained. And the dog was under the table being very still in the hope of being forgotten about and receiving things. Elara sat down and looked around her table and then looked at her husband, who was looking at her at the same moment, across the noise and the children and the lamplight and the ordinary, extraordinary evening. He had a look on his face that she knew well by now. She had catalogued it over years of evenings just like this one. It was the look that started somewhere in those creekwater eyes and extended outward into the whole of him. The look that was not a performance because he did not know it was on his face. It was the look of a man who had put down something very heavy a long time ago, and whose body had not yet stopped being surprised by the absence of the weight. She returned the look in the language that had been there since the first evening on the step, the private language built of years and honesty, and the specific knowledge of each other that no one else shared. The ranch hands who had warned her, back in the first days, would not have recognized the man at her kitchen table. They would have recognized his face, his hands, the particular green of his eyes. They would not have recognized the ease in him, the openness, the way he wore his own life as though it fit him rather than merely contained him. She had thought, when she came to Texas with her carpetbag and her determination, that she was building a practical life. She had not known she was also building a home for a man who had been a long time without one, and that he would build one around her in return, and that the two buildings, fitted together, would make something neither of them could have constructed alone. James finished his story. Clara finished her supper. Henry fell asleep against his father's arm. The dog gave up pretending not to be there and put his head on Cole's boot. The lamplight was warm and steady, and outside the Texas night was full of stars. This was the life, all of it, every ordinary and unrepeatable evening of it. She would not have changed a single day.